Welcome to the Active Travel Adventures podcast. I'm your host, Kit Parks. Last weekend, I read a wonderful essay about the joys of a walking trip in the Wall Street Journal, and I immediately reached out to the author to ask if I could share it with you, as well as to try to get him onto the program to give us his perspective of the value of walking holidays in contrast to a traditional holiday. And I'm delighted we have him here now. And at the end of today's interview, I'll be reading the essay that was the impetus for this entire show today. I can't wait to share it with you, so let's get started. A very hearty welcome to author Neil King Jr., author of the just-released book, American Ramble. Neil is the founder and editor of Gotham Canoe, an online journal dedicated to life outdoors. He spent 20 years reporting for the Wall Street Journal in over 50 countries, eventually ending as the journal's global economics editor. So first of all, Neil, how did you first discover walking holidays?
I went back walking, going all the way back to my college days. For instance, when I was a cab driver in New York in the early 80s, I jumped on a Greyhound bus, went to Mexico, and spent a decent part of that summer walking down the coast of Quintana Roo at a time when now all those places have been turned into resorts and whatnot, but Playa del Carmen and places like that, there was nothing there at that time. And I will always remember just what it was like to walk along that coastline with a hammock and my backpack and a few things and just camping out along the way and having way too few provisions and being stupid about not carrying enough water and stuff like that. So I had done a lot of more, kind of adventurous solo wandering. I don't even know if I'd call it walking as vacation, but I did a lot. I took a whole trip around the world for basically 17 months when I was between stints in college. And I did a lot of walking in Sri Lanka and in parts of northern Thailand. But it was all very DIY. I mean, I just made it up myself. I didn't necessarily walk particularly established paths or routes or anything like that, which I've done more of more recently. I'm sure that there are listeners to your podcast who are like wildly more versed in all of the trails and things out there than I am. But I think any of us that are converts to this as a way of travel and a way of seeing the world, we're a very close-knit club.
That's for sure. So if you had to say, what are the pros and cons of exploring a place at this pace? How do you evaluate that?
I don't think any of us that do a fair bit of walking or a good bit of walking can ever quite convey to the sort of car people how profoundly different the two experiences are. And even if you are mindfully going from site to site in your car to see, Civil War sites or whatever, your arrival there, your being there is just not the same as the persons who arrived there by foot, because of the context, the time to ponder what it is that you're going to see, what it is you're seeing along the way, and what you discover along the way. I mean, the pros are, it's all a matter of detail. It's all a matter of the finer points that are so easily missed. I took a walk. This is very tiny thing, but the other day I wanted to go to the high point along the entire eastern seaboard south of Maine, which oddly enough is in Staten Island. And it's a place called Tot Hill, T-O-D-T. And I hiked to the top of Tot Hill in Staten Island, and I found there all these wrecked, junked cars that had been abandoned on this hillside in the woods, and which was surprising and odd and funny in its way. And it was also just fascinating what you look at a 1970 Oldsmobile that's been sitting in the woods for decades, and it's extraordinary how little of it still exists. And it's that kind of ability to look at what happens to buildings or monuments or whatever when they're left to crumble and all that is just what makes walking so much fun. Just briefly on the cons, if somebody says, oh, there's a great restaurant 4 miles away, in a car, that's a couple minutes. And on foot, that's an hour and 15 minutes. So the distance is a different story. And when you need to cover a little bit of distance for some necessity, that sometimes can be a little challenging.
And I too find that you have more interaction with the local people, instead of you, this one interview I did, she said, when you're walking or biking, it's like you are part of the landscape. You're not in the looking inside a fishbowl, you are actually part of these people's days. And that's so true. I remember when I did the Cotswold Way, I'm walking with people walking their dogs. They're the locals. These are the paths they use to go places. And it's just a completely different experience.
No, absolutely. I took this walk to New York, which is the subject of this book that's coming out. And if you just take, for instance, the 2.5 days that I was walking through Lancaster County, famous for its Amish and Mennonites, this was in the spring. The Amish and Mennonites were out plowing their fields by mule and drawn plows. And you get that feeling, yes, I reside in a lot of ways in a different century than some of they do, because they're very stern in the way they go about their lives. But they would tip their hat and they would wave to me from 100, 200 yards away, because we were very profoundly in the same place. And there's an immediate acknowledgement when a pedestrian, a person out gardening, a person farming sees a pedestrian, you wave to that person, you interact with that person in some way. And car people, they're not in that same world. And that was a funny part of the walk to New York, because unlike a lot of the walks that others of us would take where we do everything to stay away from cars, I was very often on roads. And that interaction between me and the cars, after a while, the cars, even though I didn't want to get hit by one, they were a reality, but they slip into the background as just this other form of being that really has nothing to do with the walker's perspective.
So we've talked about the book. I mentioned it in the intro. So you wrote this book, American Ramble. What was the impetus of writing this book?
Kid, it was funny because years ago, I walked out my door. I live 9 blocks from the U.S. Capitol on Capitol Hill, Washington, D.C. And here in this part of the country, people go routinely from Washington to New York. And it's always a bit of a debate. Oh, is it faster to drive or take the train or fly and all this stuff? And I said, what if I just walked to New York, And if I were to do that, what route would a person take? And then I went just deeper into it. How did people used to do it? How did George Washington do it when he went to his inauguration from Mount Vernon to Manhattan? What did the postal routes, what were those? What were the old Indian trails? And I kind of got lost in the subject matter. So after I spent actually years essentially reading about everything in between, I then just set out to do it. And at that point, it was really about immersing myself in the story that the land in between had to tell. And it was such an abundantly rich story. But, part of my fascination was going back and reading so many accounts, literally hundreds of them, that curious Europeans in large part had written about the United States in the 1820s and 30s, when, nobody knew quite what was going to become of our country. It had a lot of problems, as it does now. And people wanted to understand it. So when they wanted to understand it, they would come and travel it slowly, not always on foot, sometimes on horseback or carriage or even railroad. But that was the method of trying to understand the place. And that was really my mission, was to go out and look at our national story, which is why people would be like, well, why didn't you do the Appalachian Trail? Or why did you walk nature paths or something? I was like, no, I didn't really, because I really did want to interact with people, with houses, with towns, with railroad stations, all that kind of stuff.
Obviously, you went through some historic areas like Valley Forge, but then you also went over a trash mound in New Jersey. So did you have a plan each day or even in advance, or did you let serendipity play into that? How did you decide where you were going each day?
So the walk was very much of a mixture of very exact planning and a whole lot of serendipity, because the one decision I made, which I think would probably correspond to a lot of your listeners, is that in this case, this was not a backpacking trip. Like a lot of people who walk the Camino or all the various hundreds of bigger treks that are out there, mine was a light pack trip. I was going to sleep in actual places at night. I did not camp. I did not carry a tent. I did not have a stove or a sleeping bag. So to that extent, it was meticulously planned, because I knew at least every morning before I set out where I was going to end that day, which was really important. And the route itself, I did want to make sure that I was encountering things that were meaningful for me to examine, to think about, You mentioned the Mason-Dixon line. There were a whole host of them. I went out of my way a little bit to go to a fascinating train station in southern Pennsylvania where Abraham Lincoln had paused for an hour on his way to Gettysburg to give the Gettysburg Address, and had paused a year and a half later in a coffin after his assassination on his way to his burial in Springfield, Illinois. So there were things like that that I would identify and go out of my way to see. And that really, really was important. But you walk 12, 14 hours a day, as long as you clock the first 7 or 8 in the first few hours in the morning, it allows you a lot of latitude to meander and stop and hike up a river or whatever else you want. So it's always a blend like that.
What surprised you most about the walk?
I think the thing that surprised me most is just how much it begins to change you in fairly short order, like just in a matter of the first couple of days. Not only did I, of course, get much more fit, as you do. You can do all the training you want, but really there's no better training than the actual walk itself, and you just get more fit as you go. Anybody who does the Appalachian Trail or Pacific Crest or any of these big trails will tell you the same thing. So there was that, but there was also just, it begins to open your eyes, your mind, your spirit. You become more absorbent, more, at least for me, prone to, these moments of real joy, because it just begins to change your spirit. So especially, I think, as the days pile on top of one another. And in my case, I was not listening to music. I had no earbuds in my ear. I was not doing podcasts. I was just walking, thinking, listening, looking. And that kind of meditation, I think, is really sort of what it's all about. In the book, I describe these moments of rapture that I had, and also talk a lot about the history of pilgrimaging going back millennia. And that kind of openness of your spirit is something that goes back so far in human history. And I think it is really at the heart of why any of us take these long walks. And it's additive, I would say. I'm sure you could say the same thing.
Definitely. And you were out for 26 days, too. That's a lot of time to have your solo time or your alone in your head time, for sure.
It is. And as I describe in the book, and I'm sure some New Yorkers will laugh and find it pretty humorous, especially those who have driven a million times over the Bayonne Bridge. But the day before I got to New York City itself, I was in Staten Island crossing over into Bayonne, and you go over this huge bridge from the 1930s. And I was kind of looking at my feet, just walking along thinking, and then I looked up and boom, there was Manhattan, the whole of it just radiantly gorgeous on a spring morning. And I, for some reason, hadn't anticipated it being there. And when I saw it, I was just overcome, like overwhelmed by the magnitude, the magnificence of the site, and that this was my destination. And I was kind of just like crippled by just this sense of just joy that, and I call that chapter Rapture on the Bayonne Bridge. And I'm sure people will be kind of like, yeah, right, whatever, but I think the walker really understands what those moments can be like. And you can go back into the literature of other walkers, which is a very fulsome body of work, and you'll find others describing moments like that.
Yeah, and we in particular, I think, do understand that because we purposely take vacations that are hard, and you're often sweaty, dirty, sometimes having the type 2 fun where it's not fun at the moment, it's fun laughing about it later. So we definitely get that. So it's a different thing than if you were driving over that bridge.
I love type 2 fun. That's not a phrase I'd heard before. I love that.
And so you ended the Ramble. I grew up on Long Island, never heard of that before. A nice tie-in with the name, of course, too. Could you explain what that is and what it was like when you finally got there?
Yeah. So one of the things that, is so great, particularly about talk, was very intentional to the extent that I really spent a lot of time thinking about the American story and our moments and phases of perseverance and pushing forward despite other bad things happening. And one of the great marvels of American design and urban design in particular is New York Central Park, which is just an absolute masterpiece of landscape design, and the acknowledgement by the designers of New York as it unfolded that this place was not going to work if it didn't have a big set of lungs in the middle of the island and a place where all these squeezed urban people could go out and do their own walks in a real acreage, And so in designing Central Park, Frederick Law Olmsted, the principal designer, designed this thing which he called the Ramble. That's this basically his own kind of manicured wilderness with all these contorted, twisted paths within it. And I kind of look at it as sort of his joke towards the very parallel, rigid street structure of the city itself. And it's a place where you can go and just get lost in a forest. And it's so fantastic for that in the middle of a city where, all the streets are basically rectangles. And so my whole thing was, I'm going to take this long ramble to Olmsted's Ramble. And that was also something that was finished right before the Civil War and gave people great sense of joy and freedom, even at a very grim period in American history. So that too had a lot of meaning for me.
I think that a lot of people would consider what you did scary, dangerous, are you crazy? You're going to get killed. Whereas I find that no matter where I've been, people tend to be kind, particularly to a stranger that's visiting their area. They want to show off their area. Do you agree with that? And B, do you have any specific examples of kindness shown to you by complete strangers, particularly once they realize what you were attempting to do?
Yeah, that is such a good question, Kip, because I think this idea of presumed risk or danger is just a really pernicious force. And I think a lot of people diminish their lives in some ways by having that view of things. And I'm not saying that the world isn't filled with some things that can go wrong, but it's my experience, and I've traveled all over the world. I've gone into a lot of war zone areas. I went into Iraq right after the invasion because I was a longtime reporter for the Wall Street Journal. And you go to legitimately scary places, and you often find, wow, at least in the place you are, it's not scary at all. The scariness is over there. And in my case, yeah, a lot of people thought I was going to be run over or bad people would encounter me or not, all the various risks that are out there. And I found none of that. Instead, yes, I found almost without exception, there were a couple of exceptions of people that were a little odd or slightly disagreeable, but people being very kind. And when you're on a walk, particularly something that's long-term, when you're going to a destination like the Santiago de Compostela Camino and places like that really are legitimate pilgrimages that go back of years, people respond to that whole thing. And there's a history of that goes back also thousands of years of giving alms to the pilgrim. They come through and you give them something. I think in part, it's almost a deep desire to be a part of that thing that you yourself are not going on. And a little bit of jealousy almost that the person passing by your house is off on this experience that you in some ways wish you were on. And so I guess a sign of thanks is to say, here. And one of the great moments of that in my walk to New York was, and it was a different kind of gift, but very much a gift all the same, was I was in the Amish Mennonite area of Lancaster, and I'd come to this school and met these kids who were all playing softball. And we all started to talk, and their teacher welcomed me. And one of the kids said, "Mr. Weaver, what if we were to sing for Mr. King?" And they invited me into their school, and they sang these two incredible hymns to me. And to me, that was very much their offering of thanks for my taking the effort to take the walk, stopping to talk to them, tell them what the walk meant to me. And they gave thanks back to me by singing these incredible songs to me, and then people gave me snacks and lunches and all kinds of things, very, very spontaneously.
That's a great story about the school children, which leads me to ask, did anything else either funny or exciting or tell me, what are your favorite go-to stories from your walk?
Oh, there we go. So there were these great moments where I was very keen. Let's just take, for instance, my interaction with Interstate 95, because the whole walk, I knew that lurking out there was this huge kind of grotesque conduit that is what carries the vast majority of all humans north and south on the East Coast. And I was the kind of antithesis of that. So when I was going to finally encounter the great anaconda, as I like to call it, I-95, I was very deliberate about how that was going to happen. And I did it, and I came upon it in New Jersey, the Jersey Turnpike. And my whole thing was, okay, I'm going to go up through this forest along this brook called Cranberry Brook between the Wayfair and Amazon and other warehouses, and then sneak underneath the Jersey Turnpike under the tunnel. And then I meet these people in the little town of Cranberry. And this woman says, no, Neil, you're not going to be able to do that. It's all swamp and water, and you can't get under the turnpike there. But I have an idea. And her son came and lent me his kayak. And then I kayaked up. It took me 25 minutes or so. I had to climb over various fallen tree debris and all this stuff to get there. And then I made my way under the Jersey Turnpike. And it was just a fantastic moment, as somebody who's driven up and down that 8 lanes of highway so many times, to have gone under it. And there was a deer crossing the brook as I came out the other side. And, there were great herons. And, there's another world right there that the highway vantage point never sees. And that was just such a great example of it.
That's funny. They mentioned 95. When I first saw what you were doing, I was like, why? I've driven that turnpike 1,000 times. It's ugly. It's awful. It's horrible. But then I was like, I've also been up and down those states. We have a beautiful country. There's a lot to see. How far were you from the turnpike? And did you try to see the pretty parts too? Or how did you do that part?
That's what's so funny, Kit, is that I went for quite a long time, many, many months. I would tell people, I'm going to do this thing, and walk into New York, and they would scrunch their nose and they'd be like, why? Oh, gross. And, the whole thing that came to mind was me walking up by 95 or along the railroad tracks or something like that, which, by the way, I still kind of want to do that version of the walk because I think it might be bizarre, and I would try to do it as fast as possible. It would still take probably 10 days. But anyway, no, I carved a more roundabout route. I went up into the parts of the country away, certainly a good ways off of I-95 that were the most meaningful. And pretty much without exception, I was on smaller roads, lanes, whatever. And occasionally I was walking old railroad tracks and stuff like that. And what you can find, even if you are getting into urban areas, is there's still pretty amazing pathways. I mean, I'm talking about, again, roads that you can take that aren't just sprawl. And now I've talked to people that are like, oh, I have a place in Maine and I live in Boston. I'd love to walk to my house in Maine. And I'm like, just do it. You can find perfectly good routes to take. And I would love to do some of this kind of do-it-yourself rambling in California and in a lot of places. And my message to people, I'm not really claiming I'm going to create a nationwide rambling movement, but that out any front door, anywhere in America, if you put enough thought into some destination 2-3 days away, a week away, and you plot how you would do it, where you would stay, why you would do it, what you're going to see along the way, study the old maps, study the old travelogues, the whole thing, any of us can create just an extraordinary experience that will tell us so much about ourselves, but so much about our own country. And I really do think that is the case, that you do it in Kansas, you do it in Nebraska, you do it in Georgia. There are just great walks to be taken that are not established necessarily, but first-time walks that can tell whole stories.
Yeah, I wish that the U.S. was more like Europe in that respect, because Europe is just a network of all these traditional paths that you walk. And I know you did the South Coast path. I did the Cotswold, the West Highland Way. They're just the traditional ways that people got from one village to the other. And it's just a wonderful way to see the world. And that's why I've been such a big proponent that if you're reasonably fit, you can do it. And in Europe, at least, they'll even carry your bag for you. You can hire a company to transport your luggage, and so all you have is a day pack.
No, I know. And I'm sure a lot of your readers, and there's so many great writers out there, Robert McFarlane, of course, being one of the preeminent writers about this kind of thing. And his book, The Old Ways, which is all about the old ways, of which there are, so many over so much of the country. And, in England, I was in the in the Lake District with my wife last year, and we rented a house, and you just go on all trails, and you could see that just basically right out our door, we could get to everywhere you could ever want to be anywhere in the Lake District if you wanted to walk it. And it was just amazing. We just kept our car there. And for the next 4 days, we would just take various paths and trails to Wordsworth's house and all those things. And of course, that's one of the really most famous places for the sort of, I don't know, the birth of kind of modern walking, considering that William Wordsworth and his sister were two great apostles of the whole walking. I read the other day that somebody estimated that Wordsworth had walked like 170, some, crazy thousands of miles, because he also took huge walks in Europe and all over England. And so anyway, yeah, you're right. It's just really amazing, the public spaces that exist in those parts of the world that are so amenable to this kind of walking.
Yeah, so if somebody's not as daring as you were and then still thinks, ooh, scary, don't want to do that, there are established paths. And of course, I've got them all over the website. And I'll link to that in the show notes, as well as, of course, I'll link to Neil's book, his online journal, his website, as well as all the other links that we've discussed in today's show. How did doing this incredible walk change you or even your opinions of America? Or did your mind get blown somehow?
It did a lot, in a lot of ways. I mean, I will say, and I had a funny conversation that I recount in the book, where on the last day when I'm in Manhattan and I meet a friend who had gone through a whole not so fun kind of cancer journey like I had. And he was saying to me, we're having like a celebratory cocktail just before I got to Central Park. And he was like, well, Neil, did the walk change you? And I said, Martin, if a person at my stage in life can have a religious experience, I think I kind of basically had one. And that kind of glow that a walk like that can give you, and I'm sure that a lot of your listeners who have done these kinds of big walks, there's the combination of like, oh my God, the glow of having just finished a big walk, a pilgrimage, whatever you call it. And then also that kind of let down, like, oh, I want to be out on it again. The great thing about a walk like this is every morning you wake up and you have a destiny, you have a purpose, you have a place you are going. And that in itself is so satisfying that everything else that comes up along the way is bonus material, because your main thing is to cover that stretch of land and to get to where you're going. And it's the purity and the simplicity of it that's so magnificent, but opened up parts of my spirit and it brought a certain kind of calm that, in a funny way, even when I'm now back into the more distracted kind of preoccupied role, I can still step into. And I think any of us who do these things, you do kind of carve out a space that is there, that's accessible. And as for the country, we're at this point where so many people are forming their views of what we are by watching presentations on television or on Facebook or on Twitter, and basically on a flat screen. And the world is just not a flat screen. And if you go out and just say, okay, I'm going to make up my mind about what the world is like now, just based on my own inputs and the things that I see over a stretch of, it's just a very, very different story. And I'm not saying it's the only story. I'm not saying that there aren't things that are to be concerned about that are distant, but it's just a really great exercise to say, at least for a stretch, my world is only going to consist of what's in front of me, surrounding me, underfoot. And I'm not going to bother myself with all the more abstract things that are far away and that are creating whatever kind of toxic divisions that people are suffering from at the moment. And so to that extent, yeah, I think there really is a different America out there that a lot of people aren't aware of. And they might be driving right by it at 60 miles an hour and just not know that it's there. But it is.
Very nice. That's beautifully said, too. So it's been a couple years, or just about a couple years thereabouts. Is it something that you still reflect on regularly or even daily? Has it become that much part of your life?
It is something I reflect on all the time, in part because I've written this book and in part because it's about to come out and I'm talking about it a lot and will be talking about it a lot. But yeah, there's so many aspects to this, I think, that any of us that do a lot of walking reflect on a lot. For instance, you were asking about the danger part of things. I think when you are out in the world unprotected by your car, brought down to just a few possessions that you have. You are just a walker on a path, a walker along a road. There is that level of exposure, but it's also tests your powers of belonging, tests your powers of getting on with people. And it really shows, I think, of kind of a fundamental thing that some of us don't fully understand when it comes to the world, or I don't know, maybe I'm getting a little out here, but reality is not something that you just walk into and then it exists and sort of absorbs you. It's something that you create as you walk into it. And the whole idea that you light up a room or that you change a conversation or that you form the space that you walk into, I think is a really important thing. And the more infectious our enthusiasm, the more open our interest in what other people are doing, the more people respond to that. And so on this walk, I met so many great people. And I made, 15 legitimate friends in the span of 26 days, people that I'm still in touch with, people that I'm going to be seeing in the next few weeks as I go about talking about my book. How many of us have stretches of time where over less than a month, you make 15 enduring friendships? And the reason that happens, and people that go on these long walks can also attest to people that they're still in touch with, that they walked for a few hours along some path in Spain or in England or whatever. It's because you're out in the world, you're open to that kind of experience. Your spirit is not closed off in the way that it is when you're going about your daily car-bound rounds. You're really kind of a different person.
Yeah, and it is funny about, and I talk often on the show about how you meet people and you become close friends very quickly. In fact, when I am going to do the Lake District, to do the coast to coast in just a couple of weeks, I'll be meeting up with somebody I met in the West Highland Way 6 years ago that we've kept up ever since. And it's just a wonderful way that it also expands your whole circle of life of really cool people that you meet by doing something like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in adulthood, people are like, oh, you kind of think you're going to form friendships over dinner at a restaurant or just sort of in the standard indoor spaces. But the reason that I think most people form their really strong friendships in childhood or in their teens or in college is because that's a really active period where you're forming friendships out camping, out fishing, out playing football, out doing things. And that's how you really understand what a person's about, is when they're in motion, right? When they're not just sitting across a table at a Denny's or whatever. Like, that's just a static environment. So there's a reason why we form these friendships when we're out and about, particularly when we're out and about walking like that. It's just we're different beings, I guess.
I never thought of it in that perspective. I think that's brilliant. So I know you've got a huge week lined up for talking about the book, and I don't want to overextend your voice here. Is there anything else you want to tell us about the book, or any final thoughts about American Ramble?
I would just say I love how this book came out in the end, in part because it is very much of a reflection of the way that I went into the walk itself, which was to open my mind to the wonders of the things that are out there. And one thing I would love to mention, you don't even need to include this in the podcast, but I'm a big podcast listener myself. I'm a big listener to Krista Tippett's podcast On Being, which has so many great aspects to it. And she did this spectacular conversation with this now deceased poet named John O'Donohue. And I really would urge anyone to listen to that and also to read the things he has written, because his whole ethos and his whole presentation of just, it's all about how you go out into the world, even on any given day, and the open-mindedness with which you sort of approach creates sort of the atmosphere that you're seeing. And that kind of openness to beauty and wonder is something that I think we all need to practice more and get better at. And yes, we experience it when we're on walks, long walks in particular, but I also think one of the good reasons for doing these long walks is it trains you better to have a similar view of the world, even when you're just walking down the street outside your own house. it's training for having that same receptiveness on a day-to-day basis. And I just think that's really helpful.
I think that's something we'd definitely be interested. I'll put a link to that as well as a link to your new book, American Ramble. And on the website, it's also going to be available everywhere you get a book. So everybody wants to make sure they get out there and read that. It's a great book, and I encourage everybody to get that. And also email me at kit@activetraveladventures.com. Let me know what you think. Before I let you go, one last question for anybody that's on the fence as to whether he or she should go on some kind of a walking holiday or walking adventure. What advice would you give?
The obvious one, which is just to do it, and that it may seem formidable, but it's not as difficult to plan or get underway as you might think. And when I wrote this piece in the Wall Street Journal, I got an email from an 87-year-old woman who said, "I loved the piece about the joys of walking. Boy, do I ever wish I had read it years ago. And I've spent too many of my years traveling on cruise ships, but I still think I'm going to have time to get out and do some walking." So I appreciate the story. And I was like, yes, that itself is so gratifying. It's never too late. Do it.
Thank you again, Neil, for coming on the program. It was very nice to meet you.
Likewise, Kit. Take care. See ya.
And again, the name of the book is American Ramble, and stay tuned because I will be reading the essay that brought this interview together. This is Neil's essay, The Joys of a Walking Trip. In order to spare his voice, because I know he's going to be on the circuit promoting his book all the next couple of weeks, I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. We were walking a stretch of England's southwest coast path when my wife and I stopped to marvel at the cliffs plummeting to the Atlantic and the ancient stone wall that snaked alongside us. In a couple of hours, we'd come to a village, stop for soup and pints of beer, and keep on walking. There wasn't anything in the world we'd rather be doing, we agreed right there, than walking that path that skirted the sea. We all have many reasons, art, food, the splendor of a certain mountain or beach, to travel to far places by plane, train, or car. But if just once in your life, here's my advice. Take a long journey on foot. Nothing gives simple joy and satisfaction like walking. A long stroll over days or weeks can reveal a world and a self you didn't know existed. It can open you up to a state of deep attentiveness and reverence that is otherwise elusive. I'm not talking here about groaning under a backpack along the Appalachian Trail or frying eggs over a fire, though that's fine too. The walk I'm recommending emphasizes lightness of foot, the sparest of knapsacks, ample time for idling, and a snug bed at night. Thoughtful packing, eateries along the way, and the occasional laundry stop will keep things light. The beauty of a walking trip isn't just that you will take it slow, but that you will wake each morning with a task at hand, a destination, and thus the truest sense of purpose. You will put an X on the map 10 or 15 miles away, and then discover a host of wonders in getting there. In that way, the journey itself contains a multitude of small destinations that you don't know exist until you find them along the way. A funny pub keeper, a gorgeous falcon, an oracular gardener leaning on her rake. I have made walking a centerpiece of my travel since my college days in the early 1980s. One summer, I walked a long stretch of the Mexican coast in the state of Quintana Roo on the Yucatan Peninsula, sleeping in fishermen's huts and in a hammock strung between trees. The sweep of those bays and the feel of the sand underfoot stays with me even now. I trekked in Thailand and Sri Lanka, finding pockets of the exotic that were inaccessible by car or bus. Most recently, I stepped out my door near the U.S. Capitol and proceeded one spring morning to New York City over 26 days and 330 miles. Walking immerses you in the particulars of the world in ways that no trip by car or even bike can ever do. My walk to New York revealed a country I didn't know existed across a swath of land I'd crossed by car and train many times over decades. On foot, I found a dozen micronations along the way. The walk shows how a spring unfurls mile by mile and hill by hill in layers of subtlety and complexity I'd never seen before. It taught me the regional nuances of barn design and left me gaping at the remnants of our past, the stone bridges and canals and rail beds I crossed along the way. It brought me to the driveways and porches of people I wouldn't have met any other way. There have been 400 or so generations of humans since the dawn of civilization, but just 10 have passed since the age of steam upended our pace of life, which may explain why walking over distance taps into our earlier selves. you begin to understand why the prophets were almost all walkers, and why their parables, their sudden illuminations, their telltale encounters with a single stranger, so often happens along roadways. Walkers often prompt unexpected acts of generosity from the people they pass, though this varies dramatically from country to country. People along my route to New York offered free snacks and coffee and bottles of beer, tapping a tradition that goes back centuries of giving alms to the pilgrim. But no strangers threw open the doors to their house to offer me dinner or lodging, as happened hundreds of nights for the British writer Rory Stewart when he crossed Central Asia by foot more than 20 years ago. The American journalist Paul Salopek, currently on an epic walk from Africa across Asia and onto the tip of South America, has seen boundless hospitality in nearly every country he's passed. When walking over multiple days or weeks, you begin to see why the journals of slow travelers like Thomas Jefferson or Henry David Thoreau or John Muir abound with startling, tiny details, the sort of things few would ever notice now. Saw and heard a katydid, Thoreau notes on a trip to New Jersey. We have seen no persimmons in any place since crossing the Hudson, Jefferson jots on a jaunt to Vermont. This submersion springs from the consideration and respect you can give every odd thing you find. Driving is at least 20 times faster than walking, but you realize after a few days that walking is 100 times more meaningful. A long walk in the Grand Canyon becomes a lesson, step by step, in the power that water has over rock. Days wandering through Amish country in Pennsylvania leave you wise to the subtle variations in house or buggy design among the many sects there. You can stand for an hour on an English path trying to figure out how that herringbone wall was built. Perhaps only a neuroscientist or mystic can explain this, but walking somehow elongates time and leaves a deeper imprint on the mind. I might struggle to recall the day-to-day details of a long road trip, but can summon vivid sequential scenes from weeks of walking. On the walk to New York, I made a dozen friends in less than a month, people I keep in touch with 2 years later, and likely still will 5 years from now. Friends who have trekked stretches of the Appalachian Trail or done the Santiago de Compostela pilgrimage in Spain, or long paths in England or Portugal, rave about the many bonds made with fellow pilgrims as they went. You are more open when walking, more receptive, more enmeshed in the landscape through which you pass. The Irish poet John O'Donoghue had it right when he said that we should learn to walk out our doors every day. Quote, with an open heart and a real watchful reverence. If you do, he said, you will be absolutely amazed at what it will reveal to you. If someone told me I had a couple of fit, robust years left, I would dedicate that time to walking. It doesn't have to be an elaborate weeks-long walk. A recent trip to Tuscany became a series of long daily walks to various hill towns, returning each night to the same place. In England's Lake District, we rented a house and then spent days walking village to village over mountain and down long valleys, pleasing the ghost of William Wordsworth and earning our lunches, as we never would on any road trip. The world abounds with worthy walks, many of them famous, well-marked, and well-documented. Some go back hundreds or even thousands of years. The foot-worn paths of pilgrims or penitents. But if you set yourself right and do your homework and pick a destination that resonates within, as New York City did to me, there are many walks of wonder right out your front door. I sure hope you've enjoyed today's show. I really appreciate you listening. Until next time, this is Kit Parks. Adventure on!